Imagine you're entering one of the most magnificent, most glorious palaces in the world. Everything is covered in gold gilding, chandeliers are gleaming brightly, silk and satin fabrics stretch to the floors. Your eyes are dazzled, you're speechless. But the moment you take a deep breath, such a disgusting smell hits your face that it's the kind that would instantly wilt the flowers standing 30 steps away. Yes, dear listeners, welcome to the 17th century Palace of Versailles. This is a very strange place where beauty and filth walk hand in hand, where elegance is soiled with sewage. We're talking about an era when royal women, despite their jewels and noble bearing, lived through a complete hygiene nightmare. You truly won't believe what you're about to hear. Before listening to these forgotten stories, if you love learning the hidden truths that history conceals, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more content. Let's begin. Here are the 5 worst hygiene habits of those noble ladies. 1. Not touching water or soap. Literally. If you were a noble woman in that era, there were expectations of you. To be elegant, to be attractive, to look flawless. But when it comes to personal cleanliness, things go awry. Because taking a bath, that is what we call personal hygiene today, was something avoided like the plague back then. Why? Because the scientists of that time, namely the court doctors, believed that hot water was humanity's arch enemy. Can you imagine? They thought hot water opened the pores and let diseases into the body. Add to this the church's propaganda that bathhouses are dens of sin. And there you have a society that fears water like a monster. Women didn't even have private bathrooms. Daily showers? Comedy. In fact, most had never truly bathed in their entire lives. Washing the entire body was considered unnecessary, dangerous, and even sinful. So, what did these people do? Nobles, including even queens, wiped their hands, faces, and perhaps briefly their necks with a damp cloth. But that cloth wasn't dampened with water either. It was moistened with alcohol, vinegar, or, this part is a bit nauseating, saliva, and they wiped themselves that way. Supposedly, these methods cleaned the skin without opening it. The most painful part is, let's say they finally decided to wash, which happened about once a year, and bathing alone was considered shameful, so it was done as a group activity. Family members took turns entering the same tub and used the same water. Guess who goes first? Of course, the men. By the time it was the women's turn, that water had already turned into something lukewarm, murky, dirty, and full of sediment. What was the effect in the palace? Let's put it this way. That heavy smell didn't just stay in the stables. Everyone walking the corridors of Versailles complained about that unbearable odor. Old perfumes, sweat smell, animal fat, and mildew. Whatever you were looking for was there. Even though they looked like angels from the outside, they walked around with skin that hadn't seen soap for months and a heavy odor. 2. Where's the toilet? Answer, everywhere. We've finally finished the bathroom disaster, but there's worse. Let's get to the toilet matter. Think of the Grand Palace of Versailles. Magnificent architecture, Europe's most powerful people lived there. But lo and behold, there were almost no toilets in the palace. Yes, you heard that right. Hundreds of rooms, thousands of guests, but no toilets. Instead, they used pots called chamber pots, hidden under beds, behind curtains, or in closets. You relieved yourself in this pot, then, if you were lucky, a servant would hurl the contents out the window. If the wind blew the wrong way or someone was passing below, they could meet with a terrible surprise. In fact, some didn't even bother with chamber pots. Men urinated off balconies, relieved themselves in the gardens among the bushes. Visiting ambassadors were frozen in shock at what they saw. Corridors were literally used as temporary toilets. Yes, you heard that right. The magnificent long and large corridors of the Palace of Versailles were used as toilets. Imagine you're a lady while gliding down the corridor in that voluminous, expensive dress. You had to lift your skirt, not just for your grace, but also to avoid stepping on human feces scattered on the floor. The situation had gotten so out of hand that in 1715, a royal decree was issued. Palace corridors would be cleaned once a week. Not even daily, look. Once a week. And this was considered progress for the palace. Oh, and by the way, there was no such thing as toilet paper either. Cloth pieces, leaves, straw, or in the most desperate moments, hands. Washing those hands afterward wasn't really their custom either. It's not very hard to understand why diseases were so widespread. 3. The living ecosystem on the head. Wigs and lace Versailles was the heart of fashion. The craziest manifestation of this passion was women's hair and wigs. These weren't like the hairstyles, They were practically architectural works. Women's hair rose almost a meter above their heads, decorated with ribbons, pearls, miniature gardens, and even ship models. Yes, seriously, ship models. To make these towers, wireframes, horsehair, cotton-like padding were stuffed inside the hair. Then, pomade, made from animal fat, usually beef tallow, was applied to hold the hair in place. This oily, warm, and humid environment, as you can imagine, created a perfect nest for lice. They even had tiny ships to board, after all. Women didn't wash this hair often. In fact, they almost never cleaned the wigs. The result? Lice infestation. So much so that almost every noble woman had a lice colony in her hair. Ladies carried long-handled, specially made silver louse spoons to deal with this. With these tools, they could scratch their heads and get some relief without ruining that magnificent hairstyle. These spoons had become so normalized that a woman at a reception could take a sip of her wine, then gracefully move her hand to her hair and scratch her head with that spoon. Look at the sight. She's scratching. The hair smells of old grease, but no one falls behind in fashion. Because in that palace, appearance meant power. These wigs could sometimes be so heavy that they caused neck pain, and sometimes they could catch fire from nearby candles. But what can you do? The show must go on. 4. The royal table and its parasites. Now let's move on to a more pleasant topic. Food. Royal feasts were legendary. Tables were filled with meat pies, pastries, roasted ducks. But behind these luxurious tables, a nauseating truth was hidden. The palace kitchens hadn't gotten their share of hygiene either. In fact, the palace's sewage system was so terrible that sewage waste sometimes reached even the kitchens. It's a documented fact that wastewater reached even Queen Marie Antoinette's private kitchen. There were no refrigeration systems, no ventilation, no waste management. Food constantly spoiled, meats quickly stank, vegetables sat out in the open for days, vermin and mice literally threw parties in the kitchen. But the cooks had to serve these meals to the royal family no matter what. The result? It brought stomach ailments and infections with it. Diarrhea, vomiting, infections had become part of daily life. But the scariest were the parasites. Intestinal worms, especially tapeworms, were very common among royal members. The cause was raw or undercooked meats and dirty kitchens, of course. In fact, it's said that King Louis XIV himself passed a 15-centimeter tapeworm. Think about it. Even the king couldn't escape this situation. Palace women also had to pose gracefully at those magnificent tables while struggling with nausea and cramps, silently, without spoiling the appearance. 5. Public births. And we've come to the most special, most painful part of women's lives: childbirth. For royal women, childbirth wasn't just painful, not private at all. It was also a public event. In the 17th century France, when a queen gave birth, this was considered a national matter. The birthing room would literally turn into a theater stage. It would overflow with palace members, doctors, priests, and a bunch of noble spectators. Not to help, just to watch. Why? Because the birth had to be witnessed. People feared that a stillborn baby or a girl would be secretly replaced with a healthy baby boy. That's why the entire process had to be in everyone's sight. This meant, while the mother was in unbearable pain, a room full of people were watching her. No privacy, no dignity, only pressure. Marie Antoinette fainted during childbirth from that crowd and the suffocating air in the room. Moreover, childbirth was extremely dangerous. Medical knowledge was dragging on the ground. There were no antibiotics. 1 in 3 children died before reaching age 3. Mothers also often lost their lives to infection. The reason? Unwashed hands, non-sterile instruments, and of course the palace that had turned into a germ nest. In short, while those royal births looked like celebrations from the outside, inside they were experienced as a complete horror, pain, and pressure film. There you have it. The 5 disgusting truths beneath those golden halls of Versailles. Behind those glittering dresses, perfume-scented halls, and jewels, noble women were actually living lives filled with discomfort, shame, and disease. Monuments of grace in front of the public, but in their private lives, people fighting for survival while scratching and suffering. History always tells us about the balls and ceremonies, but the real stories can be much dirtier and just as human. Continue exploring the past until next time. Because history isn't just fascinating, sometimes it's truly disgusting. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit like if you want to learn more hidden historical truths.